Greetings from Glasgow at the COP26, where MSF is participating for the first time, adding your voice to the call to action and the recognition that climate crisis is a health crisis. Saving lives, alleviating suffering, and promoting dignity are the core of the work of MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders. And as a medical humanitarian organization, health is our core business, especially in humanitarian setting and responding to emergencies. And our actions are guided by medical ethics and humanitarian principles of impartiality, neutrality, and independence. Migration is a direct determinant of public and individual health, and our teams work alongside people on the move at their places of origin during their treacherous journeys or at the points of arrival. And in many of our experiences, we see firsthand that such upheaval represents desperate necessity rather than a choice. The lack of access to care for this population, as well as challenge in accessing them to provide care, make them even more fragile. And while MSF is engaged in several medical humanitarian projects related to the different health needs in migration, whether that's in Italy, France, Belgium, Greece, or along the Balkan route, in Brazil, Venezuela, Mexico, or more, we are sometimes also prevented in operating as in Nauru or in the search and rescue operations in the Mediterranean. There are many reasons for displacement and migration, including war, conflict, persecution, natural disasters or repression. Different weather, climate-related events, and environmental degradations also influence mobility patterns. The unpredictable conditions influence whether persons affected by these events have a real choice to leave or to stay, and whether they relocate near or far for the short or the long term, and whether they are forced to flee or voluntarily leave. While displacement and further migration from severe weather events are the most visible patterns, we are also already seeing people leave because they have lost their land, their herds, their living space, and the vital ecosystem services caused by irreversible environmental and climate changes. Even in the best case scenarios, if we were to meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal of the Paris Agreement, millions more are expected to be moving. The relationships are painfully obvious to us at MSF between climate change, migration, and health, and as we witness the suffering of the people we serve, yet this population remain voiceless and faceless, left to prove their plight. It is perhaps not by chance that we are speaking today at the Cassandra Conference. Cassandra, the Greek goddess of prophecy, cursed to have the gift of vision but never to be believed. It reminds of the struggle to convince decision makers of the reality of climate change, of the plight of the people on the move, and the centrality of health in each. We are today facing a true emergency, only to worsen if no action is taken. The urgency is in believing and acting definitively now. Thank you for this opportunity to speak today.
Thank you for the invitation to the Cassandra Conference. We live in an accelerated global change of ways of life. People's habits are in a transition phase, and transition is not only for ecology, agriculture, or energy, it is also a human transition. And without getting into the Anthropocene, I would like to place the human interactions in the center of a virtuous circle. We are discussing today climate change, health, and migration, and how these interact and affect the human being. So how and why people are forced to migrate, whether it is climate, political, or a pandemic crisis, or a combination of the three. This makes people vulnerable. And vulnerability has health consequences. Reducing immunity of people and generating more disease, and getting into the One Health cycle, environment, animals' health, and people's health, interacting one on each other. It affects definitely the human being. The refugees for whether they are political or urban rural exchanges, have been accelerated with the COVID-19 pandemic. Everything goes too fast. And this creates a situation of insecurity, and the adaptation is very brutal. And this is why today we have to see how to coordinate solutions to adapt to this new way of life and to consider the relationship between this climate change, this migration, and our health. Thank you very much.
On behalf of myself and Human Right to Water, I will refer to climate change, health and migration from a human rights perspective. Human rights are fundamental rights to which each person is inherently entitled. They are conceived as universal and egalitarian and embody the basic standards without which person cannot realize their essential human dignity. Recognizing access to safe drinking water and sanitation as human rights in 2010 therefore means that everybody is entitled to them. The list of countries that have committed to respect human rights in the region is long. From a very practical point of view, this means that there are legal tools that can provide solutions applicable to an adequate management of water resources. Following the principles and criteria of the human right to water and sanitation, we will have a guide to increase their resilience. While it's true that the access to water and sanitation has been affected by climate change, harming the most vulnerable populations, children, women, and migrants, also is true that the governments must ensure that people do not lose that access, nor access to sanitation facilities, without neglecting the obligations that other actors also have. In this sense, if the human right to water and sanitation are respected in public policies and laws, it will be possible to decrease the insecurity. First, maintain access to water and sanitation during a crisis must be mandatory to assure a minimum volume of water per person. Second, quality. Testing on a continuous basis the supply of drinking water and disposal of wastewater is needed to avoid contamination of water supplies. People need to be alerted immediately if there is a contamination incident. Third, provision of service without discrimination is critical to ensure that vulnerable people can maintain dignity. Methods of inclusion and indicators. And fourth, communication channels are essential to ensure adequate notice of any change in supply, quality on water, and sanitation services to everybody. Climate change affects access to water, health, and the habitat of populations globally. Migrants are a vulnerable population. They need to be protected. Their human rights should be respected by including them in national legal frameworks and regional and international public policies. This first simple step will help to protect their rights.
my country is because of Boko Haram, where they are disturbing our people. I'm from northern Nigeria, from Kaduna State. So I wanted to travel to come Libya to get safe life.
Venant de la côte, le pays, la côte. Nous avons quitté le pays parce que notre famille paternelle a voulu nous exciser. L'excision, à cause de l'excision, on a quitté le pays avec l'aide de notre police.
On a été torturés par les Nigériens. Ensuite, d'Agadez, sur le désert, nous sommes arrivés à Saba. Saba, il y a certaines personnes qui ont fait la prison. Ils ont été kidnappés par des Libyens. Ils ont fait même 3 mois, 1 an. Ils ont été torturés. Chaque matin, on les frappait. Ils pouvaient faire 2 jours sans manger. Donc c'était un peu trop difficile.
If they see you, at times they will sell you. These other people sell blacks in Libya. Locked you up to prison, tortured you, for you to call your parent. Before ever releasing you, you pay $2,000 to release each person when they captured you on the way.
Getting to Libya, some mafia took us as hostages. They asked us to pay 2,500 dinars. So we weren't having the money to pay. They decided to sell us to human traffickers. So they did. We were sold to different houses.
Good afternoon and welcome to the session panel 2 of Cassandra Conference about climate change, health and migration. I'm happy to moderate the session. I'm Andrea RUBINI from Europe, and I welcome Maria Guevara, GERARD CANALS, Marco TULIO CABRAL, Véronique Briquet, Logier, Géraldine Genet from different organizations. We have seen, their presentation, their introduction, and well, it's a challenge. It's not a challenge to go through such an important set of topics, because we are talking about climate change, we're talking about the impact on health, and impact on, of course, on migration and our societies. Now, looking at the introduction and to the backgrounds, of these topics, we are pretty used to see the news about disasters, for instance, displacing people. And if you look, to the the most recent report of the IMCD, you see that most of the internally displaced persons belong, the causes are because of disasters. But disaster is something that happens now, and it has a tough, terrible impact. It could be related to climate change, but then something else that we see that is impacting slowly but with an increasing strength is the slow impact of climate change on health, migration, and food security. So, to what extent we could prepare ourselves to tackle this? What could be in our plan, in our action, the consideration that we should have, considering the impact of the climate change beyond the disasters, on migration, on health of the people, on the food security, at global level?
Can I start?
Sure, Marco, you're welcome.
Yes. Well, there are essentially the two main fronts for addressing climate change. They're mitigation and adaptation. First, it's not a matter of relative importance. Both are equally important. But yes, we need to address the causes of climate change, to mitigate it, to make sure it doesn't get as bad as it could get. So yes, our main reference there is the Paris Agreement, and strive as hard as possible to stick to 1.5 degrees over pre-industrial levels of global warming. But some climate change, no matter how much, is inevitable. So we need to address adaptation. And this is a very broad issue. It changes a lot from place to place. Whereas the causes of climate change are global and the phenomenon is global, the way it impacts locally varies a lot. So it's about addressing vulnerability in agriculture, in access to water, healthcare, so a wide range of issues. In the case of Brazil, for instance, the scenarios suggest that there will be a decrease of rainfall to the tune of 30%. In two key regions of the country, the Northeast, which is the most vulnerable in terms of water scarcity, it's a semi-arid region, and the Center West, which is the most important grain-producing region in the country. So this is likely to be a cause of migration, especially in the Northeast. Migrations of this type in Brazil mostly occur internally in the country and not overseas. The Brazilians who migrate overseas are usually better off than those people. They are the ones who can afford international travel, but this will certainly cause moves of population inside the country. So, we do need very effective policies of adaptation inside the country to address the impacts on agriculture, also on power generation, since more than half of our generation comes from hydropower, and these areas impacted by reduced rainfall are precisely where some of the key basins are located in the country. So this is just a local example of a much broader issue, and we'll have to work very hard on adaptation to address all those impacts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marco. Any other comments?
If I may interject, Andrea. So first, let's go backwards a little bit on, I just wanted to highlight a different parts on the concept of phenomenon. And I think migration, just honing in on that, is, for some might not be a natural phenomenon, but it is for the animal kingdom, of which the human species is one. And I think, historically, when habitats fail and deteriorate, all species move to find food and shelter. And I think, in that sense, it's quite natural that we move around. But ideas of border is a man-made phenomenon. And part of those is, speaking of anthropocenic, but it's also anthropogenic. And I would look at it as a doctor, we would call this iatrogenic, because any intervention is actually made by man. And part of now the fact that borders have built up is because of war, violence, etc. And as well represented in the video already, which is from OpenC, is it's highlighting why people move today. It's because of this war and the violence, and it's because of human rights violation and persecution. The majority of the time, those who are moving because of environmental issues and climate are probably a small proportion of them today. What we see is a failure of the policies actually that are trying to address this migrations and the failure of protection. People move seeking safety, security, and just a means of survival. And policies today demonize and degrade these people and criminalize those who are trying to save lives. So we need to look at this man-made phenomenon that we are contributing to the cause of migration. And if we look at climate change, the Anthropocenic issue of humans being at the center of drivers of this today, with the majority of the acceleration of climate change today is because of man-made issues. And we just come out of the COP, and the policies are unfortunately diluted as far as the pact that's come out, but it nevertheless highlights the importance of keeping the Earth warming at more than 1.5 degrees. And this, we know that the more these happen, the warmer the world gets. People will move, and I think we need to be conscious of what we need then to address as a human cause, to find a solution as the human species, to try to ensure that policies we put in place are matching what we need in a rights-based way, in a non-discriminatory way, with a humanitarian lens. Thanks.
May I? Of course, I agree what Marco and Maria says. From a human rights perspective, one of the conclusions of the COP26 is that the crisis that we have is a human rights crisis too, and is to put the human being in the middle of everything that we need to do. As Maria says, we have to include in the policies. And what is incredible is the European system of human rights is the best system, is the only international system that generates binding obligations for the state. And then and know that is to know that we have tools that we need to use. From a lawyer advisor, what I have to say is we need to use the tools that we have, and all the vulnerable populations need to be protected before, during, and after the migrations. Of course, they need protection, and the state have the obligation, and it's something that is important, I think.
Thank you so much, Geraldine. My question is about, Marco before said, we need other climate adaptation policy to be in place and even to be developed, because so far it is clear that the current policies are not enough to tackle the impact of climate change. But being able to adapt our society to climate change can help potential migrants not to become the new migrants of the upcoming days. This could be enough. And once again, do you think that the supranational organizations and the states are doing enough in order to consider migration as one of the impact of the side effect of the climate change at the larger scale?
Well, I certainly think not enough is being done. We have seen the discussions about finance in the Glasgow COP, and the level of ambition is clearly below what is necessary. There was a commitment for there to be a flow of $100 billion a year of climate finance by 2020, and this target was missed, and so we are always below what is expected and what is needed. It's an endless task to start with, but certainly more could be done. So we need to work harder on that. We need more political will. This at the international level, but it's also true at the local level. So for instance, I will give examples from my own country, Brazil, but of course, similar situations happen elsewhere. So we have very serious problems with deforestation in river basins, and this is causing siltage in very important rivers in the country. So there's a lot of work to be done in replanting these riparian forests to protect the river basins that we have. I mean, precipitation will decrease, but we can do more to protect those rivers, to minimize the impact of climate change there. And in fact, those regions in Brazil, they are not really deserts. If we manage water well, we could do much more with the water that's available. There are some government programs to collect and store rainwater. They have already had a very positive impact there, but much more could be done. Much more could be done also in optimizing the use of water in irrigation and connection between different river basins. On aggregate, there's a lot of water in Brazil. We're the richest country in fresh water in the world, but we do have specific spots where there's serious water shortage. So more could be done to connect river basins to make sure to stabilize flows of rivers in different parts of the country. So a lot could be done in all those areas, and this action is needed. The forecast I've seen from the IPCC 6th assessment report is for a comparison between 1995 and 2040. Within this period, it is expected that about 30% of we expect a decrease of about 30% rainfall in those parts of the country, as I mentioned. So it's very serious, and it's not 2100, it's 20 years from now. So we really need to work hard and fast. Thank you.
Yes, Andrea, if I may. Yeah.
Sure.
So as the Water Joint Programming Initiative coordinator, I really feel compelled what you said, Marco, and of course I agree to all what has been said now. The action we were trying to have as a Water JPI initiative with a global outreach, it's to make more cooperation on those grounds, and river basins is definitely something we are looking at, and also cooperation with Africa. And it's quite new because we've started already cooperation with South Africa, with the southern region, SADC, and more we are moving up to the West Africa, but also Mediterranean area. And there is already an initiative on the Mediterranean area. And definitely this climate change affects a lot the management of water. And what you've said, Marco, is really true. Sometimes it's not the lack of water, it's also the management of the water. And there is also all this groundwater that has to be managed and protected. And I think that there is a lot to do. And you were saying that European is quite advanced because with the legislation, we are quite advanced on that. And I think there is something to work on about the groundwater protection in countries and with the climate change effects.
Thank you very much, Veronique. So it is, I mean, I understand that there is a role for the international cooperation, because if we want to have a real impact on climate change and what climate change generates in terms of impact on migration, on health, on food security, on overall security, of the people at global level. I think that there is the need for a synergic and systemic action at global level. But how this can be implemented? What kind of tools we have at hand now? Or do we need new, innovative, disruptive tools in order to make it happen?
I think there was one of the key issues on debate in Glasgow as regards finance for tackling climate change was the ratio of resources that go to mitigation versus adaptation to climate change. Adaptation is the poor cousin of mitigation in that there's much more political will to address mitigation than there is to address climate change, than there is to address adaptation. Well, there is some good reason for that, in that, of course, we must face the cause of the problem head on. That's correct. But at the same time, adaptation is needed because some climate change is already happening and much more will happen irrespective of how hard we work on mitigation. So we do need adaptation. And it's sometimes, frankly, it's sometimes hard to sell this to taxpayers and to public opinion in rich countries, because whereas if you invest in mitigation in a developing country, you're helping yourself because you're limiting greenhouse gas emissions and so on. So it's easier to sell that to taxpayers in a rich country. Whereas adaptation is a local issue, so it's harder to sell. Taxpayers will say, well, it's their problem. It's up to them to address their problems. But one way of seeing that it's more than that, it's that this connection between the impacts of climate change and migration, as previous speakers have said, if people have no option where they live, they will migrate. It's just inevitable. So this is a very strong argument in favor of investing more on adaptation as well, not only mitigation. And it should be said that there are very interesting synergies between these two lines of action. Very often adaptation actions also have positive mitigation effects. So I was speaking of replanting of riparian forests in river basins in Brazil. By doing that, you're increasing carbon stocks. So you're sequestering carbon from the atmosphere. This can be quite significant for in the overall effort to mitigate climate change as well. So very often doing one thing, you're doing the other at the same time. But as for whether we need new moves, new institutions, I'm more of a reformist after having worked with climate change negotiations for almost 20 years. I think we do have institutions that are relatively up to the task. It's more about putting them to work than creating new ones. I think we have spent too much time. I started working with climate change in the times of the Kyoto Protocol. Well, the Kyoto Protocol was destroyed for the wrong reasons, in my opinion, and we spent more than a decade negotiating the Paris Agreement. We got there, then another 5 years or 6 years to regulate, to finish the Paris rulebook and so on. So we've spent 3 decades building institutions. I think we have what we need, and we don't have time to negotiate further institutions. We should use what we have. We have the Green Climate Fund, which is a very well-structured fund. It needs more money, so it's about doing more with what we have, putting more money on the Green Climate Fund. There's also the Adaptation Fund within the climate regime. There's the Global Environment Facility. So we do have the institutions we need. We just need to use them better, to think big, and to do what has to be done.
Thank you, Marco. Thank you very much. Maria?
I think Geraldine was first. Do you want to go, Geraldine? I'll come after.
Well, of course, the funding is necessary. I think that the resilience can be built from the from the law, from the public policies, if the principles that have the human rights, all the human rights, health, life, water, sanitation, all the human rights, all the criteria and principles that guide the human rights are really included in the policies, in the public policies and in the laws, from the bottom, not only in the international laws, but from the bottom, that could increase the resilience, because it's something that have to be more touchable, more real, but it needs to be from scratch. It have to be really included. We have been working in some countries helping to do that, and I think the principles, I don't know, for example, accessibility, disponibility, quality from what to the water, or this no discrimination, transparency, all those principles, it needs to be included really in the and that can create the resilience, is what we think. That's a tool. And the other tool is the indicators. If we have human rights indicators, not only the indicators that we normally work, but the human rights indicator, then it could be possible to advance in that sense. Yeah.
Thank you, Jadid. Maria?
Yeah, so thank you. In a recent panel that I was at a week or so before the COP, I had spoken about the 3 recognitions, and one was the human impact of well, as I've spoken about it earlier on the anthropogenic, but also anthropogenic causes of contribution to climate change. But there's also the recognition that where we are working as a medical humanitarian organizations today are actually the current climate hotspots. And I know this was alluded to already in the loss and damage, and there was a worrisome discussion about that being to siphon the finance on that through the humanitarian aid rather than taking the responsibility fully. But I mean, I think it's important to note that these humanitarian hotspots, climate hotspots, are still blind spots for many in the world, even though we're experiencing it more collectively with wildfires everywhere and flooding everywhere and more severe extreme weather events everywhere. But I think it's also important to recognize the responsibility that we each have in this response that we need to have collectively for the climate change, environmental degradation. From the MSF perspective, framing this under either One Health or either environmental health, but mainly around the planetary health framing, because it centralizes the human action and the human responsibility. We're looking at it through the operations, which is adaptation actually, and mitigation or a footprint pillar, and advocacy and adding our voice to the table. And one of the reasons why we were at the COP this year, which is a first for MSF to be central in the COP itself, is that to highlight the voice of the health and humanitarian crisis, and that it is, the climate change is. And I think from our perspective, operationally, adaptation, well, I think migration is probably one of the most direct adaptation strategy that humans have. But we are looking at this on how best to analyze and mainstream that climate lens in the way we operate. And how do we use the analysis and link what we're seeing already on the ground to give more evidence and more weight to the evidence base, to assess and to anticipate. So what tools do we need to be better at responding to emergencies, that is today, but also ahead of us? But also at the heart is the mitigation, is the do no harm principle. What is our responsibility in making sure that we don't contribute to this harm, knowing as a big humanitarian organization, we know we don't want to treat patients and leave a wake of environmental damage. So we want to ensure that we also have that social responsibility to address that, and then obviously to witness to the climate for the climate people who are impacted most, already most vulnerable today, and give voice to them and highlight that emergency is today. You know, we used to talk about urgency, but it is actually an emergency today. And so the roles we can each play in highlighting that on the table and pushing states to really go for courageous policies rather than diluted climate pacts. And hopefully we can begin to reverse the changes we've contributed to this planet. Thank you.
Andrea, if I can go back to your question about the tools, and do we need disruptive tools to address this question of synergic and synergy and systemic actions for climate change? I think well, there is a great word going around the table here, which is adaptation. I think to adapt the tools, existing tools, is much better, and also it's going to be more innovative on the ground. And I'm thinking about the living labs. We've had already several living labs, examples of several living labs in several initiatives where you have actually the civil society, you have also the NGOs, and you have also the private entities, some enterprises, and of course everyone is on the ground and trying to understand what's going on and how we can mitigate, adaptate to this climate change, and also adapt our tools. And there is one very interesting, for example, in South Africa, in one of the townships where the water sanitation also is cruelly missing, and also you can tackle the way the diseases are spreading, because, as you know, in South Africa there is also tuberculosis, resistant tuberculosis. So, and there is also another living lab in Zimbabwe with agriculture, and you have a different way of managing water with the climate change, also how you're going to obtain, no matter what, your crops that are going to grow, and you're not going to leave the Zimbabwe because indeed the crop is going to grow. So I think it's those tools that we have to focus on, and that's very, very important. And of course it's very nice to have international cooperation tools that are very elaborate, but it's also very nice to adapt them and to include the civil society and to include everyone. And again, private sector is very important to be included, because they represent also the civil society to a certain extent, and they answer the base of pyramids needs. So that's really important, I think.
Thank you, Veronique. Thank you very much. I think that, I mean, what I heard from all the speakers today is that the recurrent words, I mean, urgency, emergency, that fully apply, I mean, to both the topics, I mean, climate change and migration. I mean, they're both under the lens of the emergency, are both under the lens of urgency. Now, there is something else that we should also consider. That's, I mean, in the recent times, well, and less recent times, I mean, migration was not that, let's say, welcome phenomenon from most of the richer or industrialized states, countries in not only Europe, but I mean, we have seen, I mean, what happened in Europe in the last years concerning migration, also through, basically, I mean, through Italy and other way in. The question is about, I mean, the matter that we are sure that we are going to have additional impact of climate change in the next years, despite what we are going to do in terms of efforts, and we have more migration coming, more migration because also of climate change. Now, I mean, you have seen that this displacement sometimes in Europe has been interpreted as a threat. Do you think that this could be a potential increase of extreme reactions, for instance, in Europe, because right-wing movements and so on? Could this, could be a factor that could increase extreme reactions in Europe against migration? That goes, towards just the opposite of what we should, to restore dignity to people.
If I may start. And this is part of why I started with migration as a natural phenomenon, because I think narrative really matters today in the multilateral arena and the way we frame things. I mean, if we just take health security as we're fighting COVID pandemic today, when you link health as a security threat, it drives it down and stigmatizes health in a way that becomes a blessing and a curse at the same time. But I think, when migration is seen as a threat rather than a natural instinct of humans for survival, and not really looking at the reasons behind that is important to remember. And I think, at least if we were to look at the situation of the Mediterranean, this is, I know you all have heard that we feel this is an entirely avoidable, predictable, policy-driven humanitarian crisis. And this is, the refugee conventions and all those were there based on respect for humanity. And actually it's a rights-based and universal declaration of rights. It's saying everybody has a right to humane treatment and for protection. And unfortunately, we're disrespecting all this because we've become a very nationalistic kind of inward-looking people, much as societies. And I think we need to remember that Arthur Wint had this great article a few years back in 2018, I believe, where he was mentioning the 3 myths that needs to be broken about climate and migration, which is that, there is a difference between temporary and permanent. And when there is sudden onset disasters, people don't usually want to leave their homes. They are forced temporarily to leave because of extreme weather events. And I think that we need to remember that, it's a long process before they actually decide to leave. And when they leave, it's not going across the world. It's actually in their neighborhood. So neighboring countries within the region. And I think we need to keep that in mind, that people don't actually have the resources to travel far to avoid the climate related events. And many eventually become imprisoned population because they don't actually have the means to travel. I think we need to remember this, that people don't have the instinct to leave. They unfortunately move further south. I just came from, or at least to safer air, higher ground, or whatever that might be. I just came back from Lake Chad a few months ago, region, and there we were responding to Cameroonian refugees and Central African refugees within Chad. And part of the reasons why there were Cameroon refugees at that precise moment was because there was fighting between the herdsmen and the fishermen who were digging holes so deep to try to get to water, and animals were falling in. So there was a huge tribal fight. And so the village broke out in a battle, and homes were being burnt. So people were moving because of this, because they couldn't sustain their livelihood, and what they had was, it was tragically falling in pits, etc. But, and I think we need to remember that wasn't, they didn't want to necessarily move. They kind of ended up moving because of the resultant process from them trying to survive from day to day. And I think we need to keep those stories in mind.
Can I pick on this point that Maria mentioned about the fact that people don't necessarily want to migrate? It's out of desperation. It's out of a complete lack of options that people leave their countries. It's not for sport that they do it. Brazil is a middle-income country. I mean, we have a long way to go. We have very serious poverty problems in the country, but certainly other countries face much harsher situation than ours. But still, I think there are a few interesting lessons to be learned. We've had an economic boom in the first decade of the century, and especially in the first years of the 2010s. And during this period, we've had a return of about 10% of Brazilian migrants who were overseas, who came back from Brazil, who came back to Brazil. Then with the deterioration of the situation, they migrated again. But this illustrates that if people are offered opportunities at home, they very often prefer to stay in their own country than leave. So it's not an inevitable problem. It's a man-made problem, and we can address it with clever policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco. I pick some few words from you. I think offering opportunity at home is a win-win situation.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, as we said, we have climate change impact that is flying over our heads. We need, adaptation and mitigation measures to be put in place. But offering opportunity at home, it is also something that we can promote, we can boost, we can support by having a better understanding of the economic challenges at global level. What do we need? Apart from financing initiatives, is the need for restructuring or working again on the economic equilibria that could help people to get opportunities where they live or they were born.
I don't think it is only an economic opportunities that they need. I think the people need more than economical things, because if the policies and the laws and the environmental social situation is against the people, then even if they have the economical opportunity, they don't gonna have the dignity that they need. And it's why I was talking about the from a very practical point of view, the respect of human rights in a region, in a country, is what it gives is dignity, and then the people need dignity, having where to live and food and water and sanitation and environmental equilibrium, economical things too, but it's another one, I think so.
I just, forgot to tell, to everybody that unfortunately GERARD CANALS had connection problems and couldn't keep on joining us during the session. So once again, there are recurrent words. We say urgency, we say emergency, we say dignity, we said, financing, and we said, also global action to be taken. How much, international cooperation should play, a more decisive role in driving the global policies, in supporting whatever must be done in order to reduce the impacts of climate change and support countries with high level of migration to be able to provide them with the necessary measures, tools, instruments to make it happen?
Well, I think a lot is needed. Climate change it's by far the biggest challenge of our generation and probably the next generation. From my previous experience with environmental issues, we like to compare it with the ozone layer problem. Well, it cost a few billions of dollars to address the ozone layer problem. It's the greatest success story in environmental regimes, and it deserves all the applause. But the thing is that it cost roughly $40 billion, something like that. When we're talking about climate change, we're talking about trillions. We're talking about restructuring energy sectors all over the world. We're talking about replanting riparian forests, as I was saying, as building dams to protect against sea level rise and so on. It's just gigantic. And so a lot of international cooperation will be required. The issue of climate justice is very significant. I mean, roughly speaking, the countries most responsible for causing the problem are very different from the countries which are most vulnerable to the problem. So those who are suffering are those who least contributed to the problem. So there's a very strong moral case to be made there for more help. It's needed, otherwise we won't address this issue properly. So that's it. We need a lot of international cooperation. The only thing I repeat here is that I think we don't have time to spend renegotiating again the institutions we have. I think we, at least as far as the climate regime is concerned, I think we have enough to address the issue. What we need now is implementation. We've had sufficient negotiation. They were important, but we have the infrastructure in place. So it's about implementation now. It's about putting money, working hard, and addressing the issue.
Yeah, and also putting the citizens all together, and it's already very well done. I think there is a march going towards that, and this is what you were saying earlier also, Andrea. This is about systemic. So we have to see the planet as a complex system, and not act only on very small part, but really globally to see to really act. And indeed, Marco, you're right. It's a matter of money. It's a lot of money, and implementation. But this systemic approach, because one cannot do something small there. It's going to of course have an effect on the entire planet. So that's really this complex system, like for water, the cycle of water, it's really about the whole planet. Yeah.
Yes, I fully agree, and thank you so much for your contribution. I think that we went through, a number of important issues, today, and discussion was really exciting because we've been able to really touch all the complexity of the climate change and its impact on migration and health and security of the people. So I think that we have reached the end of the session. And I take the opportunity for thanking, of course, EURCAT for this great opportunity, and to thank all the speakers that contributed today to this very important panel on migration and climate change. Thank you so much. See you hopefully soon, somewhere, somehow, and all the best. Thank you once again. Thank you so much.
Andrea.
Bye. Great pleasure speaking to you all.
Thank you, everybody.
Very nice meeting you. Bye.
Bye, too.
Bye.